Welcome to Perusing's Appraisers on Purpose podcast. Our podcast showcases inspiring appraisers and professionals from the industry who are leaders in their field. How did they get to where they are? What have they learned along the way? What can we learn from them? Your host is real estate investor, entrepreneur, and appraiser, Michael Hobbs.
Well, welcome to another episode of Perusing's Appraisers on Purpose podcast. Thanks for joining us. I'm your host, Michael Hobbs, and I am thrilled to have our guest, Jonathan Miller, with us. Jonathan, thanks for joining us.
Oh, great to be here.
It's a pleasure, man. I'm sorry we're not in person, but thank you for technology that we can connect like this.
It works.
There's no cold beverages that we're sharing, but if you have one, I'll go get one, and we can make the most of it here, just like those times.
No, this is dry February 10th. So
July 25,
right.
So it's been good better for the waistline. So
right.
But fantastic. And friends, we definitely appreciate you being part of the community. We continue to have wonderful growth in terms of sharing ideas, sharing and building community, and most importantly, creating new opportunities through the joy and privilege of hearing about our peers and their lives and their professional journey and how they've gotten to where they're at. I have no doubt today will very much fulfill that sense of curiosity with such a insightful and curious peer as Jonathan. So, Jonathan, we always want to know, were you born this way, or how did you get into the appraisal profession?
So first of all, it is a genetic fact that no one plans to be an appraiser. It just, in fact, in most real estate professions, it's always by accident. No one in high school knows what an appraisal report is.
Oh, no chance.
Right. So, and I gave up after a while. I have 4 boys. Explained to them what I did for a living. It was a odd thing.
Oh my goodness. That is way too funny. And it was way too odd for them to get their arms around.
Yeah. Like we didn't really encourage them to take over the business or anything like that, just to do their own thing, mainly because I was worried how long the residential appraisal business would be around.
Yeah, of course. That's understandable. I mean, at some point, it's fascinating. The quick thought that comes to my mind is I have 2 uncles that still farm. My dad grew up on a farm, and that's how I spent a lot of my weekends. And one of my uncles has embraced technology. He has always he's investing in the newest equipment and machinery. He's gotten narrower in his focus on the farm. And his brother, who also farms about the same amount of acreage, they're not an insignificant amount, has maintained older equipment because he just isn't embracing. He has nice equipment, but he doesn't have the cutting edge stuff. Like he likes 15, 20 years older because he can still really work on it, and it's not as much computer oriented. And it's fascinating. They both coexist. And they have a very different They have a very different presence in the marketplace. My one uncle focuses on basically 2 crops. The other, much broader offering, works the whole year, so to speak, has some livestock in there as well. I mean, it's wild that you touch on that. And for the time being, both can still exist, but it's getting harder for my one uncle to compete.
Yeah. Yeah. My dad was one of those people that he lived on the bleeding edge. Very early, the first one to have a color TV in the late 60s, the first one to have a VHS recorder, all that sort of, any kind of gizmo. He always seemed to be like 3 to 5 years ahead. So I guess I'm kind of like that, but I used to just be so excited to get the new Mac or iPhone or something. Now it's annoying. So I think I'm running out of steam. I've got other stuff to do than install software.
Oh my gosh. Or better yet, have to deal with I'm sorry, well, I won't go that way. I'd say with the interaction of maybe a new OS across existing hardware that causes
doesn't work.
Like it worked the other day. Why does it not work now?
And you're on a deadline or whatever. Yeah. So the sort of the charm of all that is I still nerd out on stuff. Like the other day, I was flying to visit family in Michigan with my wife, and I decided I've got one of those bird feeders with the
Yeah.
the camera sensor, an audio sensor, and it's on our house Wi-Fi. And I literally live stream from 35,000 feet on my iPhone going through the Wi-Fi on the plane. And I thought, okay, that serves no purpose, but it's super cool. So I do sometimes waste my time with stuff like that, but that's only because it's cool. It doesn't really help me in life.
I would be a bad friend if I didn't acknowledge that sometime back in the fall, I don't know what I was reading, but I came across some article and it was curious. I use the Mozilla browser, so I appreciate some of the articles they suggest. And one of them was about, I think it was a journalist who had installed like a Wise or a Nest camera outdoor, but then there was a bird that made a nest on top of the light, and they literally like live streamed this bird that actually built a nest, gave birth to I think laid 3 eggs, and there was saga and there was drama and there was death. I mean, it was all free. I mean,
it was entertaining.
Massive number of people that were following this. So I'm glad you're one of those from 35,000 feet.
Yeah, I've been known to follow eagles' nests in California, live streamed stuff like that. So, yeah, sometimes, I think I've learned that we've overweighted the importance in technology, but we sort of can't live without it, but we can't live with it at the same time.
Yes.
It's weird.
That is indeed something else. So you grew up in a household with sounds like a parent or parents that were earlier adopters of technology.
My dad was a serial entrepreneur, so he did the whole gamut. And he was sort of the tragic entrepreneur where just as it was starting to make money or peak, he lost interest and went to the next completely different thing. And so as a result, I feel like I've got an entrepreneurial heritage in, starting this company, with my wife and my sister. And my parents sort of funded us, our appraisal company, but I'm a conservative entrepreneur in that, I don't lose interest and go off to something else and let everything fall apart. That was sort of the story of my father, who, love him and appreciated everything he did. But it was all about the journey, the Steve Jobs thing. It wasn't the reward. And that was a person that lived that. I mean, he had a real estate company, did a lot of syndication. Then he went to the hotel business.
Yeah.
Then he went into one of the largest franchise of McDonald's in the world at the time in the 70s in Central America and the Caribbean.
That's
and
amazing.
Then lost it in like 3 years. And then he started this color. He had his deal with a Fortune 500 company that he basically walked in. Thiessen was the name of the company. And he created this 3-dimensional sort of computer model for, color has 3 things, tint, chroma, and hue and chroma. And he created this sort of 3-dimensional concept, which was tied into decorators. And then he started a French cooking school in the National Association of Cooking Schools. And we'd have Julia Child at our house and stuff like that as a kid. So it was just like perpetual, like always doing stuff. And I learned caution from that because it was a world full of like high highs and a lot of disappointment too.
I can only imagine the amount of disappointment that comes on the back end of, like you said, going from being the largest McDonald's franchise operator and then in a matter of years and then going.
In 2 years, he turned something that had never made money. And then once he started making money, international law is like, it's sort of there, but it's decorative. And McDonald's decided, hey, they're making money. I want it back. And my dad had 3 attorneys. They had 30, and it's a battle of attrition. So, he went on to the next thing, right? So, there's a lesson in that, but it's, it's sort of a painful process, I guess, when you see you see your father go through that stuff.
Oh my gosh. I mean, how does that not influence you?
Right. Totally. So, like I said before, like I have an entrepreneurial background, starting a company when I was 25 and, I'm in my 60s and it's been a 40-year run and it's still, we have employees and all that stuff. But I do a lot of other stuff on the side, a lot of things that aren't necessarily in the appraisal industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's from my dad and the sort of the entrepreneurial sort of side of it, not being afraid to do that.
That's amazing to get exposed to it. So, you grew up in a family definitely with a strong, strong entrepreneurial streak, more than the vast majority of people we've had a chance to connect with. And were you involved in any of the syndications or any of the real estate as a young person, or tell us?
No, I was when my dad bought a hotel in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, with some investors. Like, I'd go in there, and I think my sister did too. Like, I'd be a bellboy or fold towels. And I remember when he tore the hotel down to build a new one, we ended up, I don't remember how many rooms there were, but like this was in the 71 or 72.
Okay.
And he ended up taking like 13 of the TVs in the rooms and bringing them to our house, but they were black and white.
Okay.
So I was giving black and white TVs to all my friends. And, and that was in the day when there was no remote and you sit next to the TV and you click the channel.
Oh, yeah.
And black and white. Pretty crazy. But I was never, on the business side. It was just more. That's why I actually went to Michigan State for hotel management.
Because you wanted to fold towels.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I only lasted about 3 years. The company I went to work for out of college got bought by Marriott, and I did not want to be in the industry. And I actually ended up this was in Chicago, and I ended up being a real estate agent for about 6 months, and actually became the number 2 agent in our little Century 21 office, and realized I didn't want to do it, but it was, as a profession for my career. But man, compared to, the hotel business, 80 hours a week, it was not like that. And it was much. So I enjoyed the freedom of it, which led me to New York, which led us starting our appraisal business.
But I mean, you mean the allure of leaving Michigan State via another employment to get you to Chicago wasn't enough to keep you there.
No.
The East Coast pulled you back.
Yeah. I mean, I was born in Boston, grew up in the Washington, D.C. metro area, and then I'm not a native New Yorker.
Yep.
And we ended up, my wife has a big family, and one of her brothers went to University of Michigan and met somebody from Long Island. We went to a wedding in Long Island when we were living in Chicago, and we were there, and we stayed in Manhattan at a hotel, and then I don't remember how we got to the wedding on Long Island. My wife and I were walking around Manhattan and saying, "Oh my God, we have to live here." And we went back to Chicago.
Yep.
Within 3 weeks, we sold our cars, quit our jobs, and moved into Manhattan. My dad, in one of his entrepreneurial things, had a 1-bedroom apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And my wife and I slept on the floor for like 6 months, got jobs, got an apartment, and then a few years later started our business. So
that's amazing. I love that.
So, when you're in your 20s and you don't have any kids yet, that's a time to take risk.
It's a great time to take risk.
You're not wedded to anything really, other than worried about fear and, where, you're making a mistake because you don't know. But that's really where that's when you make your move. I remember my dad always saying that, in your 20s, you don't know anything. You're just trying to learn and figure things out. In your 30s, you make your move. And then your 40s and later is you cash in, or, that's where you make your your wealth or achieve, accrue your wealth. And I thought that was a good thought.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thing. So you come to this conclusion, we got to be here. So you
Yeah.
and your wife, does that mean you all were both Spartan?
Oh, yeah, that's what I met her greasing donut trays at 5:30 in the morning at the student bakery, which was part of the second largest non-military cafeteria in the world, like Michigan State. Now it's like 55,000. I had a great time there, and the hotel business and all that stuff. But yeah, we just met greasing donut trays and the rest. And we've been married for 41 years. So
wow, congratulations, John.
Thank
That's
you.
really impressive.
Thank you.
That's really impressive.
It's all good.
So what employments did you all first take when you got to the great borough, Manhattan?
I became a sales agent, on-site sales agent at a new condo.
Okay.
And my wife did the same thing in a different building.
Oh, wow.
And then I want to say, that's where we got the idea for the appraisal company, because Manhattan doesn't have a multiple listing system, a traditional multiple.
Still doesn't.
It still doesn't. It has the Real Estate Board of New York and something called RLS, but it's not like what you think of in Chicago as an MLS.
Mm-hmm.
And until, we were there in the mid 80s until for 20 years, sales data was not public record. So we didn't have an MLS, and you couldn't, and there was no online looking stuff up. So we had to just call people all day and ask for data. And we built a database, and we just did things a little different than anybody else did. And it kind of worked. And still today, Manhattan doesn't, have an MLS, although there's a lot of data sources, but the quality sucks. So you have to, like when you're verifying a comp, a piece of data, you almost have to verify it like 3 different sources to fill in the whole picture.
Oh, it's intense.
It's just very inefficient. And, and then you're dealing with a lot of odd things. Like, I know you have some co-ops in Chicago, but
nothing compared to you guys.
Co-ops are like 75-80% of the residential housing stock in Manhattan.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And they weren't public record until 2006.
Wow.
And even public record is just the price, the date, the address and the apartment number, and maybe the room count, but no square footage or bedroom or condition or photos or anything. The public record in Manhattan, for being the financial capital of the world, is kind of like being in real estate anywhere in the 1950s, just very primitive. And I remember when we first started, we were doing things like we used Scantron. You remember when you take
Scantron?
Yeah, you take SAT tests and school tests.
Oh yeah.
We did our on-site appraisal firms for Scantron forms, and we used like red flare pens to sort of write on them. They wouldn't scan, so they wouldn't mess up the scan. And then you'd come back from your inspection and just run it through a feeder. Say you inspected 3 properties, you'd run it through both sides of the sheet. One side was the building and site info, and the other side was the apartment. And that's what you did. And then we
basically built a kind of a template kind of form that was Scantron oriented, so that you can come back and, this one's low rise, mid rise, high rise, clear.
Yep.
But then, that's really intelligent. Eliminate the duplicate.
Did a lot of that, and just trying to be efficient. Not being robotic, but just trying to be efficient. So it wasn't like every appraisal wasn't handmade in the sense that, and then, the building information, the next time we went into a building, a building has 300 condo units in it or whatever. All the information that we had gathered is on the one side of the page. Sure. So you had it. So you could verify that there were 8 elevators, that sort of thing. So it was fun. It was a fun time. It was sort of the bleeding edge, trying to figure out, get it going.
Jonathan, I've heard no one tell us they used the Scantron form as a way to systematize the data gathering that was repetitive.
Yeah, we even had and this is in the 80s, we even had little credit card size scanners.
Really?
You just ran it, like if you weren't going back into the office and you wanted to scan it, you'd run it across your form, and then we'd upload it and it would go into our database. So anyway, that's
Wow.
that was.
I gotta tell you, that's friggin' cool. That was in the 80s.
Yeah, it was just that it was sort of like a free for all because no one was doing that.
Yep.
In fact, the part I always laugh about, like we were bragging about it at the time. Mm-hmm. We were the first appraisal company in New York City to have a fax machine, which sounds insane.
Yes.
And not only did we have a fax machine, we had 2 fax machines and 2 phone lines, but one number. So if the one number was busy, we'd bump to the other one. So because we were originally like a verbal was faxing the Fannie Mae form, stuff like that. It wasn't very sophisticated. And those machines ran all day, in and out. It's crazy.
Something else. That's something else. If I could, you mentioned that both you and your wife had an opportunity to work in sales in 2 buildings there.
Yeah.
How did you go from that to appraisal?
So what happened was, like I was saying, we had all these people coming in, appraisers, someone bought a condo unit. Yeah. We're on the 18th floor of this one building, which is the sales office. They would come in, it was still, not 100% done with the construction. And we would take them to the apartment and, give them information about the building and how many were sold and that kind of thing. And we just, saw these appraisers. They knew nothing.
Yep.
Remember, we don't have an MLS and we don't have there wasn't very much of any public record. It was a very sort of shadowy, universe of real estate information. Yeah. That's improved dramatically since. We don't have a traditional MLS, but there's all kinds of subscription services where you can get that information. And then we just got together as a family and said, let's start a brokerage business. It wasn't an appraisal business.
Yeah.
And actually, somebody that I sold a condo to when I was an on-site agent was an attorney. And I went to him and we raised a ton of money to start a brokerage company. We all went into the room to sign the papers. And we all looked at each other and had second doubts and said, do we really want to be a real estate brokerage firm?
Wow.
And my wife and sister had been doing freelance appraisal work.
Oh, okay.
At the same time, just to pay the bills and we didn't sign. A Japanese investment firm was going to put up a ton of money.
Yep.
And we just, it's the weirdest thing. We changed our minds, and then we created, we said, well, let's do it. We've seen all these appraisers. We can do this. And we just started an appraisal company, and there was no licensing back then. And the forms that banks were using were just unbelievably primitive. And we built software that you could fill it out on a screen. We were Mac nuts, and we filled everything out.
You actually built your own software back in the 80s.
Yeah, we built, it was an application called Template Maker. Okay. There was another one called Document Maker, and we wrote software. One could sort of overprint on a Fannie Mae form, and one would recreate forms that banks used. So anyway, it was a crazy, that was the fun of being in the appraisal business, was sort of all these roadblocks, sort of creating ways to make it, sort of make it work.
Jonathan, I am just enamored with what you're sharing with me right now for so many reasons, not the least of which is because literally right now I'm listening to Walter Isaacson's autobiographical depiction of Steve Jobs.
Yeah, I read that. That's great.
I'm at the point where he's at Next. So he's
Yeah.
out of Apple. He's at Next. And I mean, I know how the story, part of the story goes, but I had no idea about all the shenanigans behind the scenes. But to hear you say that you were one of those Macintosh users, one of those Mac users, one of those Apple II users back in the day, and just being on top of it.
The market right now is tough for appraisal companies. Many companies are having a hard time getting enough work with the same marketing they used to. Is your company struggling, having a hard time getting new customers or getting additional work from existing customers? The answer to this problem is easier than you think. Do more business with the people you already know. Over 10 years, the average U.S. appraisal firm meets over 17,000 potential customers. That's a lot of people you could be doing business with right now. But it's a big problem if you don't have a proven process to communicate with them. StoryLux turns this problem into an opportunity to grow. Our advanced AI marketing tool can rebuild your contact lists and harvest long-forgotten communications. Imagine reaching out to everyone you've ever met with just one click. For the cost of 1 or 2 appraisals a month, StoryLux helps you reconnect and market to people who already know you, like you, trust you, and want to do business with you. Act now by contacting StoryLux today to turn your business growth dreams into reality. Email appraisal@storylux.com. That is appraisal@storylux.com. And now back to part 2 of the episode.
I remember when we were in Chicago, just before we moved to New York, the idea of, getting a computer, I was all in. I think my first one was a PC Junior.
Okay.
And with the chiclet keys that I swapped out for the regular keys. And it was the coolest thing ever. And all my friends had, like my boss and a couple other friends had Apple IIs, whatever flavor of at the time.
Amazing.
And we used to buy like paperback books of programs and key in stuff ourselves. We did all kinds of stuff like that.
Oh, yeah.
And then when the Mac came out, that was like a religion, and we became Mac nuts and built our company on Mac, which is sort of a branding thing too. We were like and I became, when we would go to I would go to speak at an appraisal conference or whatever, we were like the Mac guys that appraise co-ops in Manhattan. Like that's what was our rep.
You talk about a unique position.
It was weird.
You have a niche. I mean, co-ops is enough, but now you get to be the Mac firm and you're doing.
Yeah, and there was no software at the time, and we wrote our own software. And I remember, I didn't know this till the end, but I think his name was Dave Biggers, like this a la mode owner that sold out to, I forget who, CoStar maybe. CoreLogic, yeah. He told me when he was leaving that he always quoted me on the stuff I said or did.
Really?
And, because of the entrepreneurial sort of aspect of it. And then, he built his company and sold for a bunch of money. And the problem with what we did is that it wasn't tech. And the problem with it is that there was no financial upside, beyond making a living, right? Yeah. And so that was always the thing. The journey was the reward, really, and has been. And then about 10 or 15 years ago, we switched to PCs, except for me.
Okay.
And because everything I do personally is more consulting, narratives, Word and Excel. I don't anymore use, this form software that all my staff uses.
Yes.
But, that was the journey. And so what's been interesting about, being very visible in the media, being very visible in New York, is that I get approached by startups all the time. I've probably been approached by about 60 different firms over the last 15, 20 years. The first one was Trulia, where before they had a website.
Yes.
It was right when Zillow came out with a website. They were about a year behind, and the founders came to my office and and I was with them, and saw how the sausage was made, and they flew me out to San Francisco twice a year.
I hope they gave you founders, like, set up a fast agreement and, at least said, thank you so much, Jonathan.
Oh yeah, no, I got options. And when they, and it was lucrative. I mean, it wasn't millions of dollars, but it was reasonable.
It was more than an appraisal fee is what you're telling me.
Absolutely. Many.
Nancy, these are the stories I love to hear because of what's possible in the world.
And that's the thing. That's the thing. Like I've of the 60 or so people that have pitched me, I've been pitched just to have my name, and then I get options and get bought out.
Sure.
I always thought of myself, I'm a really good potted plant. In other words, you can put me by the front door of the project, the entrance, and I look good, and I just sit there. And that's my philosophy, is like, and I think every appraiser is like, hey, wouldn't it be great to be paid for not doing anything? Right?
I mean,
yeah.
I hear that all the time on social media. They're like, get paid to do nothing, or,
right.
Well, money for working no time at all. I'm like,
I mean, you want to be a challenge intellectually and all that, but sometimes it's a grind. And so it is nice on occasion to be paid to not do an appraisal or to not do something just because of your, the situation you find yourself in.
That's phenomenal. So here you are, now there's more to the story between the two, but you and your wife both started out with condominium buildings, not cooperatives.
Right.
And
yeah, that
was, because for people that don't know Manhattan, they don't know the density and the makeup of the market.
Yeah. If you took Manhattan, you took the population of Manhattan, and I forget the ratio, but like if you put the density of Manhattan and put it in Texas,
yes,
with like single acre zoning,
yes,
it would just fit in Texas. Like the density is very high. It's a very compressed. And one thing remembering that we don't have an MLS is that condos were kind of in public record already, but it was very primitive. You had to buy a book. It was kind of like an old MLS book. You had to buy an old book. It was called Yale Robbins, and it was just condos, which were relatively new. In fact, for ownership, like Manhattan is a rental market. It's like 75%. The housing stock is 75% rental and 25% co-ops and condos.
Holy, I did not know that.
Everybody thinks that it's all like wealthy people in penthouse apartments. And then of the 25% that's not rental, generically think of it as 75% co-op and 25% condo. And then, 1 to 3 family houses are a rounding error, like 1 or 2%.
That must be such a pain in the.
And they're high end. Like now, the median price is $4 to 5 million, somewhere in that range.
Wow.
And and new ones are not well received. Like it's something that even if you gut it to the party walls, as long as you have the facade, it's acceptable. If you don't, and it's new, it sells for pennies. Well, I'm exaggerating, but it sells for far less than sort of authentic. So the market is really different than any housing market most appraisers see, because we don't have an MLS. The majority of our stuff is co-ops, and our product, that's in inventory or sold. And then you have to know boards, and like my favorite, in the beginning, condos, when they were built, new buildings, you couldn't tell the difference between a condo and a rental. It was just, they're the same. Today, all condos that are being built are, sort of super luxury, and rentals are not, not that they're they're shacks or whatever, but
Sure.
like condo is morphed into some other product. And anyway, what we learned is that, co-ops have these crazy rules. I actually did my only foray into academia, other than I think I told you I teach at Columbia. I teach market analysis in the summer, in the summer semester, but for their master's program. But what I found in the co-op world, just moving there and not being familiar with co-ops, is like the boards have tremendous power over who the buyer, who they admit into the building. And actually, my only foray into academia was a white paper I co-wrote with the Furman Center out of NYU that was published and analyzed like the impact to value for the board to have such control over, who's buying your apartment. And you can see the problems that sort of the legal problems that can bring. But just as an example, there are co-ops. I used to track this, but the data is hard to get now. I don't have it anymore, but where they don't allow dogs over 50 pounds.
Okay.
Right? Which is logical, right?
Yeah.
How do you police that? And so, like, you go to a board meeting, to be approved as a buyer.
Yes.
Do they have a scale there? And you have your dog? I think they just write a letter, attesting.
Okay.
But then what happens? The doorman says, hey, Fido's getting a little heavy.
Fine.
And you just bought an $8 million Park Avenue co-op for cash. Are you in jeopardy of being evicted because your dog is overweight? Likely not. But, it's like that kind of invasion of sort of personal privacy is part of the co-op thing.
Wow.
Which is very different than many people experience with single-family home ownership, which is the majority of, homes in America.
It's fascinating. So because of that portion of the market that is owner occupancy as opposed to tenancy, and then the sub portion of it that is cooperative as opposed to condominium, with the rounding error being the freestanding properties and the single family homes. So naturally, as Willie Banks would say, you rob banks because that's where the money is. I mean,
right.
Appraisal, because that's where the opportunities are.
Yeah.
For those of us that don't know Manhattan, like how many, like what kind of transaction activity happens in Manhattan in a given year?
I'd say round it around 10,000 of co-ops and condos, and then maybe 300 to 500 of 1 to 3 family townhouses.
Yeah, got it.
And but rental turnover, it's 75% of the housing stock in it. But not only that, of the 75% of the housing stock that's rental, 75% of that is rent stabilized or rent controlled.
Ooh.
So it's not open market. So what happens is, I'm sort of making this up, but
yeah,
a rent stabilized apartment might be, $1,500 a month. And the same apartment in the same building that's not rent stabilized is $4,500, right? So and so what happens is, by creating, these rent stabilization laws came into effect after World War II, when the GIs are coming back and there's a housing shortage and, rents were through the roof.
Yes.
It was a real issue, but it's sort of taken on a life of its own, and people get sort of like, it's like crippled by, they grow up in a 1-bedroom, their parents hand them the 1-bedroom through like legal process. You can kind of do that. And then they just stay in the 1-bedroom their whole life because it's such a deal.
Yes.
Which seems paralyzing to me. We see a lot of that, but that's a reality here too. And so when we first moved here, a lot of people, in the 80s, we had a massive housing boom here. And that's when we started our company, where rental apartments were converted to co-ops.
Oh,
And rental apartments tend to be studio, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom apartments.
yes.
And that not flooded, but introduced a large swath of sort of affordable housing to the masses that wanted to own them. And the insiders, if you were a rent stabilized tenant or rent controlled tenant and you paid a 500 or 1,000 a month for the apartment that was worth 3 times that, and then you could sell it. And, this is like 1980s prices where, you could buy it as an insider for 75,000 and sell it for 400,000 or 300,000. That was everybody's retirement plan. And, that was such a phenomenon. We're not going to see that in my lifetime again, because all the properties that made sense converting, most of them have probably already been converted.
And given that, you're known as the co-op guy and you're the Manhattan guy, how much of your time was, back in the 80s and 90s? What I'm hearing, you didn't say this, but what I kind of pieced together is because you were in a family that was continually exposed to technology and new things, like that wasn't foreign to you. It sounds to me like it was second nature. It's like, well, of course we're going to find a way to do things.
Yeah.
I've never heard anyone talk about Scantron. Very impressive. Having like little card reader kind of, hey, if you don't want to come into the office at the end of the day, share that with us. What else were you doing back in the 80s?
Well, one other thing we did was, it's amazing how nerdy we were when I think about this. It's been a while.
This is incredibly nerdy, Jonathan. I mean, just straight up.
I was raised, some people are raised on English, some people are raised on French, some people are raised on Spanish. Some people are raised on a traditional calculator.
Yeah.
Some people are raised on reverse Polish notation. And so my whole family is RPN. Like, we all had the 12C. And, and so, but I also had, I forget what it was called, a 41.
I don't know what that is.
Whatever. But anyway, we actually took offering plans, like before we started our company and we were working as, salesmen on, some of these new condo projects for this brokerage firm. We took the Schedule A, which is a list of, say it's 200 apartments in the building, all the apartment numbers, their square footage, their monthly common charges, monthly real estate taxes, all that kind of stuff. And we literally programmed it into a Hewlett-Packard 41C.
Really?
So you could walk around like a nerd, it was like an iPhone in the mid 80s.
Oh, God.
And you could punch up 41, they'd say, what's the price of this? And I'd punch up, 41F.
Yep.
And it would tell me, it's 1,023,646. Why we did that, I have no idea. But that's kind of what we were doing, was just anything was fair game. And we had to do it because there was no computer memory at that time with something we called bit mapping, which is just I don't even remember what that was. But at the time, it was a way to get much more information into a smaller chip. And that's what we did. So that was kind of the idea, is just to, have a handhold and walk around and have the information at your fingertips before there were, PDAs or whatever.
Yeah, that is.
And there wasn't a financial reason. It was just because you could, which I always liked. In fact, we used to go to all the Macworld. There was a big trade expo of Macintosh at the Javits Center, which is the big convention hall in Manhattan.
Yes.
And they had one there, and then they'd have one in San Francisco. And we went to the one in New York every year. And, my father, my brother-in-law at the time, and then later all my 4 boys, and we go to these Mac trade shows and get free stuff and just walk around and nerd out. And it was like it was like you're in a cult almost.
It was. It very much was.
Yeah, totally.
And book definitely highlights that cult experience as well.
But it was. Jobs called it the what did he call it? He called it the reality distortion field.
Yeah, reality distortion field.
Because he would describe something, and it was in such a way that you couldn't imagine life without it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're inclined to be interested in technology or whatever, and so when you go to this day, you go into any Mac store, I mean, it's wall to wall people, and there's a reason for it. But when I was just starting out, they were the underdogs in a big way instead of the one of the most valuable companies in the world.
That they were definitely the underdog. It's a fascinating story about Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Ross Perot and bringing all those pieces back. So that's in the 80s. You're utilizing these forward-thinking tools, if you will, very commonplace today, completely beyond the reach of most people back then. And you're in a market that is old school, like
very primitive, very primitive,
people, and having them share information that otherwise isn't available anywhere else.
Yeah, that's what it took. And honestly, I don't know. It kind of like when it's really difficult to get into something,
mm-hmm.
it's harder for you to get competition too. Mm-hmm. And so I think there was, that was part of the thing. It was just hard to get in, and that valuation changed from block to block. West 67th between this avenue and this avenue is a lot more valuable than West 66th. Why? Well, and then there's 4 reasons, right? And you only know that because you're in that market. You're a local expert.
Yes.
Whereas we would have people from, upstate New York or out in Long Island come into the city, and they didn't know which end was up. And, and that was sort of the world. So it gave us an opportunity to sort of get it going. And then, the 86, bubble burst, mm-hmm. and, we had like 35 people, and then we went down to like 8.
Oh, my goodness.
Or 9.
I was sorry to hear that.
Yeah, that's what happened then. And so it's like a boom and bust kind of world,
mm-hmm.
and that's what it is. So I like the idea of later in my career of being involved with startups, like I was telling you about Trulia, but I'm involved in periodically. I've been involved in startups, and I have a pretty good track record. I mean, I've only, six really I went with from 60, and then all but 1 have paid out, and the one that didn't pay out was really because it happened, it came online right when COVID hit.
Oh, goodness.
And that was it. So, that's the way you.
Wow.
It's a weird, and now what's weird about being I'm involved in a startup that is just launching in California, and then I've used everything that I've sort of created or learned in my business, develop, certain technologies there that, it could be the greatest thing since sliced bread, or it could be nothing, you don't know. I'm pretty confident about it, but you just don't know.
Oh, goodness. That's quite an experience in itself. And in between having that ability now to be part of a startup that you're actively working and coming to market with, and going back to that time period from, when things crashed in the 80s, went through a number of ups and downs through that process. But, through it all, you've kept the firm intact and continued to expand. And your focus is very niche oriented.
Well, it's interesting because when you talk about expansion, what happened in about 30 years ago, 10 years in, was I started writing. I was asked by the biggest real estate company in the market to start to create market studies for them.
Oh, really?
Barbara Corcoran, on Shark Tank, she sort of started it.
Okay.
And then has continued to sort of be self-deprecating. Like my report, we fudged all the numbers, and it was only based on 10 sales, and really, but but I took that idea and then like made it more professional.
Yes.
And I noticed I had something when the Fed reached out to me and complained because I hadn't put the quarterly report online yet. They were waiting for it for the beige book. And, and that was pretty cool. But that was when I knew. And what I, like for any appraiser that's doing a market study or whatever, or anybody that is doing anything that's going to reach a lot of people,
yes,
is, the word neutrality. Like I see appraisers make market studies and they apologize. Hey, the market isn't that strong. And it's like, what are you doing? You're just there to report,
Exactly.
and when the market sucks,
yes,
you have to stay the course, which is really hard.
Yeah.
I remember I wouldn't call them threats, but I would I would get the "What the heck are you doing, Miller?" kind of calls from like CEOs of real estate companies, and it's like the numbers are the numbers. And to the company I write these for, they've always supported me in that, because it's like good cop, bad cop. Like I can be the bad cop, because I don't care about your personal situation and you need more commissions or whatever. I only care about giving people information that they can make informed decisions.
Yes.
To provide a real, neutral benchmark. And that's all I care about. And what's interesting about that, learning that, is when I first did it, like there was no model to really follow.
Well, like when you first start gathering information.
You just sort of like dive into it.
Start with something, right?
You just start. And because like otherwise that day never comes. And so what I learned, think about this. If you want your report to be neutral, but any of the major news outlets will only cover it if it's their exclusive.
Ooh.
And so you have to say, no, sorry.
Yeah.
And then what happens is a lot of the smaller outlets start covering it, and then the big ones start covering it, right? But that takes like 2 years of like not getting any coverage and then getting coverage. And so that's that like principle of neutrality where you're not doing it to make friends, or you're doing this to be this trusted resource. And the value in that is, I don't know how much you followed my sort of housing notes, my newsletter battles with various appraisal entities.
Here's the thing. I don't have a problem saying this now. I took a hit because I stood up for your neutrality on that. And any one of the people that was in the room, I'd be happy to face them straight up.
Yeah.
And they still lied to me when they were confronted about it. I'm like, look, they saw you as a threat because you actually just said what you saw without citing
and questioned, right? And so, like that's powerful because you don't care, like in the sense that you're not like, oh, I'm going to offend somebody. And you're also, all you're trying to do is like fix something that's broken that everybody is so wedded to that they either don't see it or they're in it for their own advantage. And I think that's wrong. And so
I agree.
So anyway, that's literally how, when I started writing my newsletter, I took the lessons I learned from the commercial or the market study sort of, that you go neutral, high quality, you defend it to the death, and then that kind of thinking translates into lots of other things, which can be very beneficial.
No, that's fantastic. When you were asked to start writing, in this case, a market report, was that because you were already publishing, or is that just because someone had gotten your name, or is that because you were already
Okay, so that was 30 years ago. I have to remember.
Yeah, I mean,
And it was,
gap on there.
yeah, I think it was because I I was doing one of the things I found very effective as an appraiser, and I know a lot of my colleagues out there do a lot of this sort of thing too, is they speak in front of the brokerage community to say, hey, this is what's going on. And a market study is like the next step, like putting it in writing, making it sequential, that you cover it every month or every quarter or every year. And I was doing that a lot, speaking at a bunch of different companies.
Yes.
And then one company, they would have me speak to all their managers, their leaders. And I looked at that as an opportunity to get referrals for estate appraisals and, hey, do you know a good appraiser? And so it became important, as a source of new business, because I'm not looking for more, necessarily one type of work. I'm just looking to be exposed for different types of opportunities.
Yes.
Because my company, like, we appraise, like, a big part of our business is not sort of generic cookie cutter residential appraisals. We appraise a lot of hallway space, common hallway space, roof rights, not air rights, roof rights, and just a lot of oddball, the smell from a Starbucks that was improperly vented on the ground floor retail makes the second floor $1.8 million apartment smell like blonde roast Jamaican Blue Mountain. And like, what's the damage to that? Or the kids on the apartment above you are tap dancing, and when they renovated the apartment, they didn't put a proper subflooring in. What's the damage to value? And so we do lots of, or a share allocation. Someone has a 3-bedroom apartment and they're going to buy the studio apartment next door, or they're going to buy the bedroom of the adjacent 2-bedroom. Wow. So their 3-bedroom becomes a 4-bedroom. How do the shares get moved around, and what's the sort of the impact to value? Like, we do lots of that stuff. We love that stuff.
Yeah.
Because it takes thinking, and it is, and that's how we make a living.
Well, you're actually being a valuation expert. Like, you're doing primary research that a client wants, they desire, they need the answer to, and they want an expert to do it, as opposed to, there's no, in this case, you've done it enough. So you could say there's a process, there's an approach, there's a format.
Yeah.
But for the general architecting of getting to a solution, there isn't necessarily just a textbook to go read and like, oh, just plug in 1, 2, and 3 numbers and we get the answer. Like,
no, never.
It's real cognitive ability and a willingness to sit in the uncertainty to work through it and get to a conclusion.
Yeah, I like my staff. Like, over the years, one of them's my partner now. I taught them how to testify in court.
Oh, that's great.
And because I just self-taught, I've testified many, many times, and I like it. It's nerve-wracking at first, but once you're on the stand, it's like the greatest thing ever. And actually, I got to tell you a story about a Chicago trial I testified in. But
love it.
But what was interesting about, like, the response from people that worked with for our firm was, but there's no data for that. And I'm like, I said, the only answer I have for you is who's going to do a better job than you. Like, we're going to have a theory, a process, and we're going to, and like, as long as we believe it, like it's a legitimate, reasonable thing, even though there's no precedent. What are you afraid of? Like, that's the thinking. One of the things the story I was going to tell you was, years ago, I can't think of the name of the company, but there was a guy, I think he was Canadian, is a billionaire, and he owned a couple of Park Avenue apartments.
Yep.
And I was hired by the Northern District of Illinois, I think is what they're called, Chicago, to testify, do an appraisal of a couple of Park Avenue apartments in Manhattan.
Okay.
And so I flew to Chicago, and that was at the time when, I don't know if you remember, there was a TV show called Court TV.
Yes.
It was since wrapped up into something else. And I remember they flew me out, and then I just sat in my hotel watching Court TV all day. And then the agent called me.
Training to be an expert witness is what.
Right. I was ready to testify. And man, they had like all kinds of, they were going to had a giant, like 2-story screen, and they were going to play all this stuff.
Wow.
And all these like charts and graphs using my data and everything. It was pretty impressive. And I get there, and then the witness before me took longer, so I wouldn't be testifying it was like on a Friday, so I'd be testifying till Monday. So I said, basically, the federal government just flew me out to Chicago just to watch Court TV, and then I fly back. And he said, that's exactly right. And then I flew back out. I don't think it was the next Monday. It was like the next Tuesday or Wednesday.
Okay.
And I'm in the gray room with all the witnesses.
Yes.
And then they call me, they come in the room and they pick me out. Mm-hmm. And you're nervous. You're sitting there. This is federal.
Federal court. This isn't state court.
No, this is federal.
And this is.
And I walk in because this guy is, and I'm embarrassed. I can't think of his name. But anyway, they bring me in, and there's a gauntlet, just like in the movies, of reporters saying, Mr. Miller. They knew my name. Mr. Miller, you said that the apartment was worth $13 million, and he said it was worth $5 million. Like, how do you explain that? Like that kind of thing.
Oh,
and then I get into the court, and they bring me up to the witness stand, and there are 5. I think there were 5 like dining room table equivalents turned perpendicular to me. So there were like 5 tables, one for the prosecution, which had like a dozen people around it, yes. Paralegals and lawyers and blah, blah, blah. And then there were there were 3 other tables. There were 4 total, because there were 3 people being sued by the federal government.
Oh, wow.
I want to say like the CEO, the CFO, the COO. It was like the C-suite. And each of them had like
their own counsel.
12 paralegals. And so literally I'm sitting here.
Wow.
And then there's a jury of 12 people and 4 alternates to my left and the judge to my right. And I'm sitting there, and I'm sitting in front of 40 attorneys.
Oh, my goodness.
And the
cost per hour. I mean,
I couldn't imagine. And they were bragging like in the newspaper, like, one of the defense attorneys got like $2 million or, like crazy numbers.
Jeez.
And I had that moment, I'm really nervous. I had that moment. I looked around, I go, this is the coolest thing ever.
Yes.
And then I was only on the stand for like 3 hours, but it was unbelievable. And, the first question from the defense attorney was, did you give the federal government a discount for your services? And I said, no. And then like the jury laughed or whatever, like it was like he was being funny or whatever. It was the craziest, but I answered the questions and that was it. Like I didn't do anything wrong. I was the expert. So anyway,
man, that's how it goes. That's the beauty.
Totally.
Oh my goodness.
It was like one of those moments where you're like, all that years of work and everything, you had all that stuff in your head, and you could pretty much handle anything that was thrown at you. So
that's a beautiful thing. With that, Jonathan, we're going to bring this part 1 to a close, and we're going to continue in part 2. I know everybody is so excited about this, but I also like to be mindful of your kind of like estimated time frame. And with so much intrigue and a massive amount of curiosity, we will pause and see you on the next episode.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Paru Zing's Appraisers on Purpose. We hope you enjoyed learning from the amazing professional paths and achievements of our beloved guests. Before we go, please subscribe on your listening channels, Spotify, LinkedIn, YouTube, and other podcast channels to hear more from appraisers and valuers regarding their life and their work. After you drop a comment below, who is one friend and peer you can generously share this episode with? If you have any suggestions or questions for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. Just send us a message on LinkedIn and we'll be sure to get back to you. Thanks again for listening, and until we're together again for the next session of Pa Ru Zing's Appraisers on Purpose, create the change that you seek.